Chapter 5 Mystery in the Mountains by Pelican Slank. To say that I am in extreme discomfort would not be exaggerating in the least. I am presently sitting in the cheerless gloom of a damp and dreary dungeon. My neck and feet are bound, though mercifully my hands have been left at liberty to pen these words. I possess neither the vocabulary nor the eloquence to express how insufferably cold I am. The icy air has gnawed away all feeling from my face, and my hand shakes as I write. Outside, a howling wind blows ruthlessly above the walls of my prison with ever-increasing menace. The dim light of a flickering candle is all the illumination I have as I seek to record my feelings on this page. I am alone, I am disheartened, I am hungry, and I am exhausted. Without hyperbole, I can honestly declare that this is the most disagreeable night of my entire life. What has brought me to such an appalling and atrocious situation? Permit me to explain. My name is Pelican Slank, son of the esteemed literary historian Pelican Clog, butler to General Albatross Hercules Montagolin, and member of a company of prisoners recently escaped from the fortress of Gruken-Golga. 12 of us broke free from the fortress some 19 days ago, but one of our number fell to a tragic death outside the city of Kendum. At first it was presumed that his death was the result of a disastrous accident, but subsequent revelations have pointed in an altogether different direction. It now seems probable that Mr. Merlin Rhombus came to his end as a consequence of the deliberate and malevolent designs of one or more members of our party. In short, we believe him to have been murdered. Mr. Rhombus met his demise when he climbed aboard a commandeered wagon which we had been using as transport. Being parked upon a particularly steep incline, the brake of the wagon ought without question to have been firmly applied. Upon boarding the wagon, however, Mr. Rhombus set it speeding away downhill towards the Ramula ravine. Presumably he was thrown backwards with considerable force, and must have knocked his head violently upon the luggage, thus rendering him incapable of leaping forth from the imperilled vehicle. Mr. Magpie Quilk has assured us all with notable vehemence that he had carefully secured the brake the night before. This is what led us to the unpleasant and unpalatable conclusion that Mr. Rhombus was murdered. The brake must, we deduce, have been purposely released by a member of our company with the express intention of killing Mr. Rhombus. We were all well aware that he had been set in charge of provisions by our leader Montagolin. Consequently, each of us knew that Mr. Rhombus was the most likely person to board the wagon next. Any one of us, therefore, could potentially have committed this unspeakable crime. The question remained, which one of us? Since he knew and trusted me better than any of his other subordinates, it was to me that the general assigned the task of finding an answer to that question. Shortly after leaving the city of Kendum, he called me aside for a private conference.
"This is a very delicate situation, Slank," he told me. "On the one hand, it seems that we have a killer in our midst. On the other hand, it is my duty to maintain good morale among the men. Fierce and forceful interrogation may well ruffle rather too many feathers. I think we need a more subtle approach."
"I could not concur more wholeheartedly, sir," I replied.
"Therefore, Slank," the General continued, "after much careful contemplation, I have decided to delegate responsibility for this investigation to you."
"A most incalculable honour, sir," I remarked.
"What I want you to do, Slank," the General explained, "is to spend one whole day in the close company of each of the men, observing their behaviour, asking them pertinent questions, and seeking to glean information from them, all in a very subtle and friendly manner, of course."
"I think I understand you, sir," I said.
"Excellent, Slank, excellent," the General beamed. "In 8 days' time I hope we shall have identified the traitor in our midst. As soon as we get back to Gallimenia, we can hand him over to the law officers, put him through a trial, and let justice be done."
And if we do not succeed in identifying the culprit? I inquired.
You must ensure that we do, Slank, the General answered. Now, I shall allow the men a little rest for an hour or so, and then we must be away. Unfortunately, we won't be able to take Quilk's chariot with us any further. The terrain looks far more rugged than I had anticipated. We've got a long trek ahead of us. It's going to be a very tough week, I fear. So how about a nice hot cup of tea, Slank?
I shall make one right away, sir, I assured him.
Excellent, Slank, the General smiled. You're a good man, Slank. I know I have to bawl and shout at you sometimes, but I have a great fondness for you, really. Your service is not unappreciated.
Thank you, sir, I said to him. You're very kind. How hollow those words seem now, as I sit here trembling in the darkness, with nothing whatever to comfort or console me in the overpowering gloom. How starkly my estimation of the General has now been revised. But at this point I was in blissful ignorance of his perfidious nature. I departed to procure the requested tea, and began to consider whom I might elect as the first subject of my inquiries. I soon settled upon Mr. Robin Hectus. With the exception of Mr. McFiber, I know Mr. Hectus better than any of the other men, having shared a hut with him during our spell in Gruchen Golga. Of all the men in our group, I deem him by far the least likely to have committed the awful crime. My mind and heart revolt against the very idea, and my imagination is almost incapable of conceiving such a notion. Nevertheless, I am well aware that appearances can be highly misleading. I therefore decided to spend my first day with him, believing that I would very swiftly be able to eliminate him from my investigation. Mr. Hectus is the youngest member of our company, an endearingly naive and idealistic dreamer. His eyes sparkle with youthful innocence, and his countenance is invariably adorned with a bright beaming smile. I think it would be almost impossible for anyone to dislike him, although many would perhaps consider him a little infuriating. I found him that first morning sitting against a large boulder, deep in thoughtful meditation, and chewing a Tavelius toffee. "Good morning, Mr. Hectus," I greeted him, attempting a friendly smile. "I believe we shall soon be advancing."
"Good morning, Mr. Slank," Hectus returned, opening his eyes. "It should be a beautiful walk, shouldn't it? I've always wanted to visit the mountains of Cronesia. They're supposed to be quite spectacular, aren't they?"
"Indeed they are, Mr. Hectus," I confirmed. "Their beauty is reputed to be unsurpassed. It will, however, be a long and difficult journey. Have you had your breakfast yet, Mr. Hectus? I believe Mr. Quilk has been frying some bacon and eggs."
"A fried breakfast, eh?"
Hectus said excitedly.
"Fantastic!"
Hectus and I promptly made our way over to the chariot, where most of the others were consuming as much breakfast as they could possibly manage. Conspicuously absent was Mr. Ramkhan, whom I could see far off in the distance, standing upon a tall black rock and gazing up into the heavens. Very little conversation was taking place around Quilk's fire. In fact, there was an almost tangible atmosphere of distrust and suspicion. I found it rather unnerving.
"Well, men," the General shouted, "I suppose we had better be making a start. It is my intention that we should reach Mount Avernus by sunset. I advise that you take with you only what is absolutely necessary. We shall not be taking the easy route through Cronesia. There will be too many soldiers along that way. We shall instead be taking as straight and direct a route as possible. All right then, men, let us proceed."
The path ahead of us led steeply uphill, and was covered with enormous rocks and crumbling boulders. There were occasional clumps of heather growing here and there, but apart from that the terrain was barren and lifeless. There was a cold chill in the air, and a foreboding silence hung about the place. The grim grey sky carried the threat of imminent rain, but the sight of the majestic mountains looming ahead was more than enough to dispel any feelings of gloom. To see their snow-capped peaks reaching mightily into the sky was tremendously inspiring, and caused all one's cares and worries to evaporate almost entirely. As I surveyed their stupendous magnificence, it was easy to forget that we were right in the middle of a most horrendous war, far from home in an enemy country, surrounded by danger and peril on every side.
"I think I'm going to enjoy this walk very much," Hectus chirped.
"The scenery is most breathtaking, is it not?" I commented.
"Not half," agreed Hectus. "I've always loved mountains, I have. Do you know where I intend to propose, Mr. Slank?"
"Pray enlighten me, Mr. Hectus," I responded.
"At the foot of a mountain," Hectus informed me, "by an old ruined castle down by the sea. The waves crashing against the rocks, the sun setting slowly over the water, a soft breeze gently blowing through the air."
"It will be difficult, will it not, successfully coordinating all those circumstances?" I remarked.
"Well, I know the exact place," Hectus revealed. "It's a lovely spot not far from Holberdine. I can just picture Amarella standing there now, her golden locks blowing about in the wind, her beautiful face all lit up with happiness and joy. She really is a marvel, Mr. Slank, a jaw-dropping, heart-melting marvel."
"I sincerely hope she accepts your proposal, Mr. Hectus," I said to him. "It seems as though she has certainly stolen your heart."
"Have you ever proposed, Mr. Slank?" Hectus asked me.
I was a little taken aback by the forthrightness of his question, for I have never been entirely comfortable discussing questions of an intimate and personal nature. "I cannot say that I have, Mr. Hectus," I answered him, "though I have been strongly tempted to do so, I must confess. Common sense, however, has always prevailed. The woman in question most assuredly does not reciprocate my feelings, so it is not worth causing any unnecessary awkwardness and embarrassment." Upon uttering these words, my mind flew back to the grand old halls of the Montagolian estate, and I mused for some time upon the many joyful memories I had accumulated during my service there. The General himself may not be the most magnanimous master for whom one could wish, but Lady Montagolian, by contrast, has always been a joy and delight to serve. Her patience is seemingly without limit, and her quiet gentleness sweetens and transforms every part of the estate. I remember when I first arrived there as a most timid and apprehensive young man, racked with worries and aching with anxiety. It was her exuberant kindness and invaluable advice that enabled me to settle into my strange new life, and helped me to win the approval of my master. I soon felt very much part of the happy family of servants for whom she cared like a doting mother. I now miss them all very greatly indeed. Mr. Groggles, the gardener, with his endless tales about his seafaring days. Talvin, the waggon-driver, with his inexhaustible supply of jokes and japes. Kemi, the cook, with her extraordinary capacity to find grounds for gladness in even the most adverse of circumstances, and, of course, a certain young woman who must at present remain unnamed. Lunch-time seemed to arrive very speedily, and conversation was again rather strained. Knowing that one of our number might well be a cold-blooded murderer has tended somewhat to cool relations between us. Mr. Quilp distributed a selection of sandwiches among us, and we all reclined on various rocks, looking back down towards Kendham. How small and vulnerable it now looked, a tiny grey speck on the edge of a gigantic sea of green. Mile after mile of immeasurable forest cloaked the landscape as far as the eye could see, broken only by the occasional thin blue line of a twisting river.
"Do you think it's possible to see Grokengolga from here?" Hectus queried.
"I very much doubt it, Mr. Hectus," I replied.
"It doesn't seem only 12 days ago that we escaped," Hectus commented. "Seems like ages ago."
"We have been through a great many experiences in that time," I said to him. "Pursuit by Grochukans, encounters with Alkas, meetings with Tromenes, dangers in Kendham."
"Mr. Rhombus dying,"
Hectus added. "Indeed," I responded, waiting for him to expand on the subject.
"He seemed like a nice man, didn't he?" Hectus said. "I can't believe that any of us would want to kill him."
"It frequently is the most agreeable of men who end up being murdered. It is a savage world, Mr. Hectus."
"Maybe it was that man on the grey horse, the one who captured Quilk."
"It couldn't have been. We had a guard posted by the waggon all through the night. Besides, what motive would he have had? He was only interested in rescuing Miss Felicia."
"What motive would any of us have had?"
"Perhaps we have an assassin in our midst, commissioned to kill Mr. Rhombus for a price. Or maybe someone has personal history with him of which the rest of us are ignorant. Or maybe one of our number is a Grochucan spy, out to kill us one by one."
"That would hardly make sense. Why would a spy let us escape from the fortress? I'm not convinced Mr. Rhombus was murdered. There must be another explanation."
"I would love to agree with you, Mr. Hectus, but the facts point strongly to a premeditated killing." Hectus did not look at all persuaded, and he continued thoughtfully munching away at his jam and lettuce sandwich. A little while later, the General called us all to our feet, and we were on the move once again. A refreshing shower of rain descended upon us in the afternoon, making the path so excessively muddy that at one point Mr. Tando slipped up and injured his arm. He also seemed to be developing a rather nasty cold, and consequently looked thoroughly miserable all afternoon. Upon reflection, though, I do not think that any of us were particularly cheerful that day. We were all unusually quiet and subdued. Even Mr. Algothian, who was ordinarily the chirpiest and most talkative member of the group, had a rather glum expression on his face. We trudged on over the rocky hills, stopping occasionally to catch our breath, but generally making very good progress. By 11 in the afternoon we had reached the Retheranya Pass, a narrow path that cuts a winding course between two of Cronesia's greatest mountains, the Svadrin and the Ralak. How gratifying it was finally to behold these two ancient giants in all their colossal glory! What an unforgettable experience to pass between such sheer and unscalable walls of rock, knowing that no man had ever reached their summit. How delightful were those next few hours, surrounded by such unparalleled natural beauty! To crown it all, a flock of red dragons came swooping through the sky, racing over our heads in the most striking formation.
"Fantastic!"
Hectus cheered in wide-eyed excitement.
"I love dragons, I do."
"They are indeed most impressive creatures," I agreed.
"I've only ever seen a red one once before," Hectus revealed. "Years and years ago. I was out in the hills with my Uncle Glester. There was one sleeping in a little cave. We were able to get up really close, we were."
"Was that not a little dangerous?"
"Uncle Glester knew what he was doing. He used to train dragons for the Air Force, he did. He's a very clever man, my Uncle Glester."
"Is he your literal uncle, or is it merely a term of affection?"
"No, he's my real uncle, my mother's brother. He brought me up, in fact, him and Auntie Sumi. I'm an orphan, you see. My parents died when I was only very young."
"I'm sorry to hear it, Mr. Hectus. It is a savage world."
"They've been ever so kind to me, my uncle and auntie. I can't wait to see them again. I can't wait to tell them all the things I've seen. We've seen some pretty amazing stuff, haven't we?"
As I looked at this dreamy young waiter, his eyes gleaming with unfeigned joy, I found it impossible to believe that he could ever be the perpetrator of such a hideous crime as the murder of Mr. Rhombus. Surely not. Every instinct in my being cried out that this man was innocent. I felt I needed no more convincing that this was most definitely not the wolf in our midst. I was just beginning to consider which of my companions I might investigate next, when suddenly someone grabbed hold of my arm and pointed ahead.
"Now there's a sight and a half," Mr. Quilk exclaimed.
I lifted my eyes and was filled with awe and wonder as I surveyed the sight before me. We had reached the foot of Avernus.
"Well, man, there's not much point in starting up the mountain today," the General declared. "Let's get a fire going, and then we can catch up on some much-needed sleep."
"What are the sleeping arrangements going to be?" MacFiber asked. "We can't sleep all at the same time, can we? Not with a murderer among us. He might sneak away, or strike again." "You don't seem to be doing much to find the traitor, General," Volko complained. "The sooner he's caught, the sooner we can mete out justice."
"I'm working on it," the General replied. "I don't like your tone of voice, though, Volko. Show some respect. As to your question, MacFiber, I suggest we take it in turns to keep watch tonight, at least 3 of us at a time. Slank, Algothian, Tando, you can take the first watch. As for the rest of us, I strongly recommend an early night." Despite managing to collect sufficient firewood and create a small blaze, this did little to counter the chilling iciness of the evening, and the 3 of us on guard duty were soon shivering violently. To add to our discomfort, the sun disappeared behind the mountains, and it began to rain again. "What a cold and cheerless night," Tando sighed. "I don't know how much more of this I can stand."
At least we've got a nice fire going, Algothian said, fiddling with his scarf tassels. Shame we lost the tents, though. Shame we lost a lot of things, Tando groaned. Those extra blankets were in the wagon as well. I wouldn't be surprised if our very blood freezes in our veins. All told, it's not going to be a very enjoyable night, is it? I don't much fancy sleeping, knowing there's a murderer about. Quite, Algothian agreed. Who do you reckon it is? Fairly obvious, isn't it? Tando asserted. We all know who did it. There's only one Marjorian in our midst. You can't accuse Volko just because he's a foreigner, Algothian objected. It isn't noble. Volko's the man, Tando insisted. You mark my words. Much as I deplored Tando's jumping to a hasty and unverifiable conclusion, I must admit that Mr. Volko was the member of the group I most strongly suspected to be the murderer. Not only is he a Marjorian, and a most reprehensibly ill-mannered one at that, but he exhibits all the typical traits and characteristics of a cold-blooded killer. In fact, it was he whom I decided to probe and study as the second subject of my inquiries. Come the morning, the investigation would resume. Mr. Volko had not given the impression that he is particularly fond of me. In fact, he does not appear to be favourably disposed towards anyone in the group, so I knew it would prove a considerable challenge attempting to befriend him. He seemed to regard me as a rather conceited and pretentious snob, so it would not be at all easy to win his confidence. One thing I had observed, however, was the remarkable alacrity and enthusiasm with which he devoured his fried breakfast the previous morning. I decided, therefore, to raid Mr. Quilk's ice-bag as soon as dawn broke, and secure what remained of the bacon. Surely, I reasoned, Mr. Volko would be thrilled and delighted to wake up to a delicious bacon sandwich. Were this to be followed with a refreshing cup of tea, he would undoubtedly be induced into a pleasant frame of mind. So, at precisely 10 minutes past the first, I roused him from his dreams and set before him his breakfast. "Good morning, Mr. Volko," I greeted him. "I trust you enjoyed a satisfactory sleep?" Volko looked up and pulled a most disagreeable face. "What's your game?" he grunted. "You trying to get something out of me, or have you poisoned the food?" Perhaps my plan was not so assured of success as I had thought. "Consider it a peace offering," I told Mr. Volko. "I feel there has been a certain tension between us ever since we first met in Grukengalga. I thought I would make an effort to be a little more amicable." Volko stared at me superciliously. "You are a strange people, you Gallimians," he exclaimed. "I don't think I will ever understand you, but I must admit that sandwich does look rather mouth-watering. I will heartily accept your peace offering, Mr. Slank." He took a large bite out of the sandwich and chewed noisily. "It is good," he declared. "Very good." I think I saw a smile appear on Volko's face. I cannot be absolutely sure. It may have been a trick of the light, but I am fairly convinced that there was at least a hint of friendly gratitude in his expression. I almost reeled with shock. "I don't think much of this tea," he sneered, taking a sip from the mug. "Couldn't you find any milk?" The old familiar Volko had returned, rude, sour, and discourteous. "It is a little difficult to obtain in these parts," I responded. "We may be able to acquire some when we reach the coast." I decided to return to my fire and seek to catch a few moments' rest before the general called us to our feet. As I sat there, gazing into the distance, I began to contemplate all the things I missed most since leaving Gallimenia. Tea with milk, Kemi's fruit-cake, my own bed, the sound of bird-song, and most of all, the company of a certain delightful young lady. My thoughts were interrupted by a loud, angry voice. "Stone me to death!" Quilk shouted. "Where's all the bacon gone?" Thankfully, Volko had by now finished his breakfast, and the whereabouts of Quilk's bacon remained an unsolved mystery. Before long, the general had us up and ready for the next stage of the journey, an arduous climb up the face of Mount Avernus. His left leg being somewhat sore, the general began to employ a gnarled old branch as a staff, and assigned Tando the task of fashioning it into something more elegant. As expected, the climb turned out to be a decidedly wearying affair, and we stopped frequently to catch our breath. Hectus and Quilp were setting the pace at the front of the group, while Jaggles and Algothian lagged behind at the rear. I myself walked with Ramkhan and Volko, but very little conversation passed between us. By the middle of the morning, the first flakes of snow began to fall, and a boisterous wind arose. As the weather grew wilder and wilder, the only compensation was that the view looking downwards became more and more spectacular. The one benefit of having been captured by the Grotjukens was that we now had the privilege of enjoying the soul-stirring beauty of their magnificent country. Seeing it all mapped out before us really did excite something deep within one's heart. Onwards we marched, through the thickening snowfall, until we happened upon a fast-flowing stream that gurgled its way down the famous Riven Valley. Having refilled our water bottles, we sat down on the verdant grass and tucked into our long-awaited luncheon. Upon finishing my sandwiches, I immediately opened my copy of the Irondia, which provoked a rather unpleasant scowl from Volko. "You still reading that book of fairy tales, are you?" he scoffed. "You need a healthy dose of reality, you Gallymines." "I don't see why you must keep on criticizing everyone all the time," I replied, no longer able to keep my cool. "All you seem to do is jeer and sneer. You pull everyone apart, you growl and grimace all day long, you grunt and groan and grumble. You are a perfect disgrace, Mr. Volko." Understandably, Volko looked a little taken aback by my outburst, and he was stunned into silence. I hastily returned to my reading, and felt rather rebuked when I observed the title of the next chapter, "The Beauty of Self-Control." Volko bit into an apple with an unnerving degree of aggression, and grunted disapprovingly. "You must think me a very rude and selfish man," he declared, discerning my opinion with commendable precision. I struggled to think how to answer his statement without appearing unduly impolite. "I'm sure you have many virtues," I said to him, not believing my own words, "hidden away under that rough exterior." He sniffed thoughtfully and took another bite from his apple. "You don't realize how tough it is," he continued. "Being surrounded by a bunch of foreigners all day, it's enough to make anyone mad." I could barely believe what I was hearing. This cold-hearted Mardurian was beginning to open up to me. I felt somewhat uncomfortable. "I'm fed up of being bossed about by the general," he confided. "I'm not used to following orders, you know. Back home I'm the chief of my tribe. And as for the rest of the group, it's more than flesh and blood can take. Quilk with his irritating smarminess, Algothian with his annoying chirpiness, Gevins with his morbid self-pity, and don't get me started on Tando. He drives me to insanity." For a brief moment I thought that the tirade was over, but I was sadly mistaken. "You don't know what it's like, Mr. Slank. You're with your own countrymen, but I'm on my own, outnumbered and despised. Imagine if you were surrounded by Mardurians all day." This was indeed a sobering analogy. The thought of being trapped in the company of multiple Volkos was a most horrifying image. I almost began to sympathize with him. "I'm not a bad man," Mr. Volko insisted. "It's just I don't like being away from home. I miss my wife and children. She exerts a very powerful influence upon me, my wife. She seems to restrain the rougher side of my nature and bring out the good in me. I'm a kind and sensitive man, really." This I found hard to believe. It was beyond my power to imagine that Mr. Volko was in truth a sweet-natured and amiable man. I began to wonder why he was telling me all this. Perhaps he was trying to convince me that he was not the murderer. He seemed to be very defensive. My suspicions were aroused. The afternoon passed with excruciating slowness. On and on and on we climbed, breathlessly battling our way through the blinding snow, until it felt as though every muscle in my entire body was aching with fatigue. It was not exactly an environment conducive to casual conversation, so I retreated into my thoughts. Chiefly I mused upon the possible motives Mr. Volko might conceivably have had for disposing of Mr. Rhombus. However, as the afternoon dragged on, I began to find my capacity for rational thought being gradually numbed away. Relief came when the general stumbled upon a small cave carved into the side of the mountain. We staggered in, out of the ferocious wind, and collapsed onto the damp rocks. I cannot sufficiently communicate how inarticulably gratifying it was to be sheltered from the snow. "Beautiful, ain't it?" Quilk commented. "Can't beat a bit of snow, can you? Smashing!"
"I think my hands are going to fall off," Tando groaned. "I can't feel my fingers at all."
"Are we going to settle down for the night?" Gevans inquired.
"No, no," the General proclaimed. "Too early for that. It's only 11:30. We'll have a quick rest, and then we'll have to be on our way again."
"There may not be any shelter further up, though," MacFiber pointed out. "We'd freeze if we slept out in the open." "We could always make a fire," Algothian suggested. "Not enough wood about," Quilk answered.
"I could make a fire," Jackal said. "We'll have no more of your halvy tricks, thank you, Professor," the General snapped. "The snow won't last all day. We'll carry on as soon as it stops."
I decided to seize the opportunity to probe Mr. Volko a little further. It was time to bring up the subject of Mr. Rhombus and gauge his reaction. "Impossible to relax, isn't it?" I said in a casual manner. "One simply cannot relax when one knows there's a killer among us." Volko turned and looked at me disapprovingly. He maintained a stony silence. "It could be any of us, couldn't it?" I continued, desperately attempting to evoke a response. Volko fixed me with an analytical stare and shuffled an inch closer towards me. He looked round the cave, placed one hand upon my shoulder, and whispered into my ear. "I think I know who it is," he told me. "I have been watching him very carefully, and all doubts have been extinguished." "Who?" I asked. Volko cast his eyes around the cave once again, drew himself right next to me, and whispered in an almost inaudible voice. "The Professor," he said. "Why so?" I questioned. "Consider the facts," Volko instructed. "First, his age. They wouldn't send a man of his years out into the field, would they? He surely can't be a genuine intelligence agent. He must be here for some other reason. Second, his halvy. Very suspicious. Just the sort of person the Golchukans would use. Also, it means he has the ability to do things behind our back. Who knows how many times he's put us all in a deep sleep like those guards. Third, his behavior. Have you seen him whenever Mr. Rhombus is mentioned? He doesn't know where to look. There's guilt written all over his face. There's no doubt in my mind, Mr. Slank. The Professor is an enemy spy." Needless to say, I found Volko's behaviour to be suspicious in the extreme. He seemed rather too eager to shift the blame away from himself and onto someone else. Were these the desperate attempts of the true culprit to clear himself of the crime? I thought Mr. Volko's name was going to remain firmly at the top of my list. An hour passed, and still the snow did not relent. Ramkhan, hailing from the icy plains of Boromir, can read snow much better than the rest of us, and advised the General that there was unlikely to be any hiatus before the nightfall. The General reluctantly agreed, and we therefore spent the night in the cave. I was somewhat relieved. I looked forward to a good night's rest before another hard day's work, and I decided to treat myself to some rather more agreeable company in the morning. I would spend the day with Mr. Algothian. I warmed to Phoenix Algothian for several reasons. To begin with, there is his steadfast loyalty. Never once have I heard him question the General's authority or complain about his leadership. He always obeys orders and maintains a proper respect for his superiors. This is more than can be said for most of the other men. Then there is his sense of nobility. It is true that Mr. Algothian belongs quite firmly to the lower classes of society, but he nevertheless demonstrates a pleasing sense of decency and a high standard of morality. Sadly, the war seems to have eroded the consciences of many men of his class, but Mr. Algothian invariably stands up for what is right and honourable. His love of peace is another admirable quality. He never involves himself in the many arguments and petty squabbles that rise up within the group, but is at all times calm, cool, and level-headed. Yet he is not an aloof and unfriendly man, but is most gregarious and talkative. Of course, there are coarser sides to his character. That is only to be expected in a man of his low breeding. He has 3 loves that I find to be particularly unbecoming. There is his inordinate love of food. He is frequently to be found gorging himself on our provisions in the most unflattering manner. He also possesses an excessive love for wildlife. He has informed me that he keeps no fewer than 23 domesticated animals within the confines of his home, and this morning I discovered that he had acquired a lizard during his climb up the mountain, which now resides in his jacket pocket. Finally, there is his fondness for gaudy attire. All his clothes are bright, colourful, and vibrant, everything from his socks to his scarf to his flashy orange belt. Were he to dress with a little more sobriety and restraint, it would do wonders for his appearance. However, I am trying to overlook such shortcomings and concentrate on his more refined attributes. In the morning I found him perusing the late Mr. Rhombus's journal. He had evidently obtained it from the General, and appeared to be thoroughly absorbed in its contents. "Interesting reading, Mr. Algothian?" I inquired.
"Fascinating," he answered. "I must pass it on to his wife. The last writings of a noble soldier."
"Have you learned anything new about the man?" I asked.
"Not really," Algothian told me. "That's one strange thing about the journal. He doesn't really talk about himself much. No personal reflections. It's all rather matter of fact."
"An interesting observation," I responded. "You seemed to be good friends with him, though."
"He was the first fellow I met since capture," Algothian informed me. "We were taken to Golga together. Capital chap, always lifting everyone's spirits. I'd like to have known him better." "Time to be off, men," the General bawled. "Let's try to reach the peak before sundown. Out of the cave, then, out of the cave."
Trudging through the snow was a rather wearisome business, and the bitter, violent winds showed no sign of abating. Being a decidedly garrulous fellow, Mr. Algothian chattered away all day, but little of it had any bearing on my inquiry. He gabbled on about everything under the sun: singing in the royal choir, his travels in Boromia, the rules of Tocaron, the injuries of his pet tortoises, his wife's culinary prowess, his memories of the spring parade, the history of the phoenix family, and even the life cycle of the dragon beetle. It is strange that a deed so passive as listening can sometimes prove to be the most thoroughly exhausting thing in all creation. But by the time Mr. Algothian had finished, I found myself entirely devoid of energy, and I had almost lost the will to live. A kind and decent enough fellow he may be, but he could talk the horns off a Tulkin. By tea-time we had nearly reached the summit. We rolled out some blankets on the crisp gleaming snow, and were given half an hour's rest. The view looking down was unutterably glorious. The entire plain of Crunesia sparkled with the purest whiteness, and the forest beyond shimmered majestically, like something out of a story-book. I could have sat there in silent awe for many long hours, but Mr. Algothian decided he had not yet had his fill of talking.
"Magnificent!" he exclaimed, sinking his teeth into a large cream cake. "I do love the winter. Cold it may be, but it does have its compensations. Just look at that snow, Mr. Slank. Absolutely gorgeous. The last time I remember snow like this was at the winter feast last year. The entire Phoenix clan was gathered. We always have a big do for the winter feast. There we were, all sitting out on the terrace, making merry and chatting away. My wife laid on the most magnificent cream tea, lovely big scones from Caladulva, and the finest Mardurian jam. Grandfather had just started playing on the pipes, and then it began. The biggest downfall for years and years. What a terrific snowball fight we had. Then we all got together and built an enormous snow dragon. What fun we enjoyed. Simple pleasures."
"Have you finished Mr. Rhombus's journal yet?" I questioned, seeking to change the subject.
"Finished it at lunchtime," Algothian answered. "I must say he's recorded everything very accurately, though he does misquote me in one place."
"Any clues as to the possible identity of the murderer?" I asked.
"Not as far as I can tell,"
Algothian returned, taking out his lizard and stroking it tenderly.
"He seemed to get on well with pretty much everyone. I still find it hard to believe that one of us could have killed him. It's so utterly horrible. I can't imagine anyone wanting him dead. He was such a pleasant fellow."
"A worthy gentleman indeed," I nodded.
There was one very interesting thing, though, Algothian noted, about Mr. McFiber.
Go on, I urged.
Well, continued Algothian, when we first left Grukengoger, McFiber made some comment about our escape being rather too easy. Then, when we got out of the forest, he said something similar. He said it was very odd that we hadn't encountered any of Vorkron's men. Rumbus recorded it too. He said something very bizarre was going on, and he was going to find out what it was. I've a feeling MacFiber may know something the rest of us don't.
This was interesting information. I resolved that Mr. MacFiber would be the next of my subjects. He seemed to possess a keen analytical mind that could prove most invaluable in solving this horrific crime. As for Algothian himself, I saw no grounds for keeping him on the suspect list. He is too transparently honest and decent to be considered a killer. By nightfall we had finally conquered Mount Avernus. A distinct thrill shot down my spine as I stood on the peak of this mighty giant and gazed down upon the world beneath. For a brief moment all the terrors of the war seemed 1,000 miles away, a vague and distant memory, the hazy shadows of another lifetime. One felt a definite sense of invulnerability and detachment upon this lofty height. Peace, wonder, and amazement filled my soul as I simply stood still and beheld the glory of creation. My spirit soared to heights of exhilaration hitherto unknown. I was overwhelmed. The loud, sharp voice of Magpie Quilk quickly brought me back to reality.
"Where are we going to sleep, then?" he demanded to know. "It's freezing up here." "There should be some caves not far away," the general declared. "The Crendorm system leads right from the peak of Avernus to the plains of Stevros."
"I've heard of the Crendorm system," Tando remarked. "All sorts of horrors lurk within its passages. I don't much fancy spending a night in such a hideous place."
"You can sleep out here if you want to, Tando," the general replied. "But I'd rather warmth, shelter, and refuge, personally. Come on, everyone, let's get out of the cold."
The caves proved to be more than adequate as shelter from the snow. They were warm, dry, and spacious, even more comfortable than the previous days, in fact. I was optimistic that I would attain another deliciously refreshing night's sleep. I have known Kestrel MacFiber longer than any of the other men in our company. For the last 3 years his charming little inn has been one of the general's favourite haunts. The Silver Centaur is, I confess, a most agreeable and delightful establishment. The food is exquisite, the rooms are exemplary, and the atmosphere is warm and convivial. I am not surprised that the general likes it so much. He dines there at least once a week, and occasionally turns in for his breakfast. It is not far from the Montegolin estate, 1.5 miles at most, so invariably we walk there, at a gentle pace, admiring the pleasant local scenery. In spite of their bickering, MacFiber and the general have become firm friends. This explains why the general allows so much insolence from the former. I find Mr. MacFiber a very interesting person to study. On the one hand, he is a very private individual, seldom opening up on matters of a personal nature, and becoming somewhat prickly when asked intimate questions. Nevertheless, he seems to value company, and is a great deal more sociable than some of the other men, Mr. Volko, for example. By and large, he tends to be a rather grumpy old man, but I have occasionally seen him manifest a more cordial spirit. In particular, he is very kind to his staff. Although he loses his temper now and again, he treats Amarella very much like a daughter, and I have seen him talk very graciously and tenderly to Ruana the waitress. Another interesting trait is his fiercely logical outlook on life. Although prone to uneasy feelings every so often, he is a strong advocate of clear thinking and rigid reason. This seems to have made him terribly cynical, and he is suspicious of nearly everyone. I watch him with fascination. Our path that day was precarious and dangerous. Opting for fresh air and sunlight, the general led us out of the caves and on to Trover's Trek. This is a very narrow, winding road that twists its way round the shoulders of Avernus and down to the foot of Mount Trident. It is a difficult, treacherous road, on which many hundreds have lost their lives. I must confess to feeling a little apprehensive as we started out on this hazardous course. To our right frowned the steep, rocky face of Avernus. To our left, a sheer drop to the deadly Crenesian swamps. One slip of the foot would bring inevitable death. The narrowness of the path necessitated walking in single file. I chose my place carefully. I did not wish to be pushed. Ahead of me was Mr. McFiber. Behind me, Mr. Hectus. Slowly and cautiously we proceeded round the mountain.
"I can't go another step,"
Mr. Tando suddenly shouted, 2 spaces ahead of me. "There's no turning back now," McFiber returned. "Keep moving."
"You don't understand,"
Tando continued.
"I can't move. My legs have gone numb. They're frozen with fear. I can't move an inch. It's the height, you see. I've got this thing about heights."
"Stop being such a coward," came the voice of Volko from round the corner.
"I'm not a coward, Mr. Volko,"
Tando insisted.
"It's a medical condition. I can't help it. I mean, just look at that precipice. It's more than I can stand."
"Take my hand," McFiber said firmly. "I'll keep you steady, boy. If you lose your footing, I'll stop you from falling. Now take some deep breaths. Calm yourself down. Close your eyes and fill your mind with something pleasant." Tando duly obeyed and closed his eyes, clutching hold of the side of the mountain for reassurance. "Are your legs beginning to thaw?" McFiber asked.
"A little,"
Tando replied. "Can you take 1 step forward?" McFiber questioned. "Take it slowly now. I've got your hand." Soon we were on the move again, even more slowly than before, but at least we were making progress. The sun emerged from behind the clouds, and I heard birdsong for the first time since leaving the forest. Half an hour passed, and then McFiber stopped abruptly in front of me. "What is it now, Tando?" he asked.
"It's not me,"
Tando told him.
"It's Volko."
"The general has halted," Volko whispered back. "He's signing for silence." We waited anxiously for several minutes. Nobody moved. All sorts of notions came into my mind. Maybe the pathway had crumbled away. Perhaps a dragon was on the hunt. At any rate, it was obvious that some peril or other was lying around the corner. The tension became intolerable. At length I saw Mr. Volko turn round and whisper in Tando's ear. Tando in turn passed the message on to Mr. McFiber. "What is it, Mr. McFiber?" I inquired. "Bad news," McFiber reported. "Gregomines have been sighted. A whole troop of them. They're round the next corner."
"What's a Gregomines?"
Hectus queried, listening in to our conversation. "Mountain dwellers," McFiber informed him. "A cruel savage race with sharp claws and venomous fangs. Not the type of folk we want to get too close to." "What's the plan?" I asked. "The general says there's a large cleft just beside him," McFiber answered. "It leads into a long tunnel. He thinks it'll take us over to the other side of the mountain." Tando tapped McFiber on the shoulder.
"We've got to go in a few at a time," he announced. "The general's going in first, with Jaggles and Volko. It'll be our turn next."
"We'll need to be very careful," McFiber warned. "You know what the Gregomines keep as pets, don't you? Venomous bats. Deadly fanged creatures that lurk in the shadows of the Crendorm caves."
"I don't like the sound of that,"
Tando gulped. "We'll be safe as long as we're quiet," McFiber reassured him. "They're blind, you see. Can't see a thing. Mind you, their hearing is quite spectacular. If one comes close and you make a sound, that's it. They'll sink in their fangs and you'll have 10 seconds to live." "How do you know so much about them?" I asked. "I'm an avid reader, Slank," he revealed. "My one great passion."
"You should see his library," Hectus said. "An absolute treasure house."
"Pass the message down, Hectus," McFiber commanded. "You'll go with the next group. We 3 had better get going."
"It gets worse and worse,"
Tando moaned.
One minute it's terrifying precipices, the next it's tunnels full of venomous bats. It's gonna be one of those days."
"Courage, Tando, courage," MacFiber exhorted. "There may not even be any bats, but we can't be too careful. Remember, if you see the flashing light of 2 red eyes, freeze to the spot. Don't make a noise, not a single sound. Your life will depend on it. Come on then, gentlemen, in we go."
And so it began. Daylight and clean air were left behind, and blackest darkness engulfed us. With one hand groping along the rocky wall of the tunnel, and the other stretched out in front, we trod silently forwards. With no way of telling whether our next step would find solid ground or gaping chasm, we stumbled blindly onwards, clinging on to desperate hope. The further we went, the more suffocating the darkness became, until I thought I could bear it no more. Somebody grabbed my arm. I think it was MacFiber. He directed my arm towards the roof of the tunnel. I looked up. There above our heads, flickering with deadly menace, were 2 red lights, a Crendorm bat. We froze to the spot. The words of MacFiber echoed in my head. "Don't make a noise, not a single sound. Your life will depend on it." One false move and the bats would have us. My whole body tensed up. I tried not to breathe. I felt a strong compulsion to swallow, but feared it would spell instant death. My throat tightened. It was as dry as dust. I could stifle it no longer. I gave in and swallowed. The red lights flashed. There was a blood-chilling squawk. The bat drew nearer. More red lights appeared overhead. There must have been a dozen of them at least. My throat began to tickle. I needed to cough. I dared not. With every fibre of my being and every ounce of strength I could muster, I fought to suppress it. Sweat poured out of me like a torrent. My legs began to shake. I felt as though I was about to collapse. I was desperate to sit down. All sense of time vanished. I could have been there for half a minute. It might have been 100 years. My back began to ache. My neck began to itch terribly. How I yearned to reach up and scratch it, but again I dared not. I heard Tando's foot scrape against a stone. There was another dreadful squawk. There was a flapping of wings. Something landed on my shoulder. My whole body was aflame with fear. Utter horror filled my heart. I prepared myself for death. Nothing happened. How long could I continue like this? I could endure it no more. My neck was screaming for relief. My legs were about to give way. My throat was about to explode. I was on the verge of surrendering. Then came a flash of light, a glorious, blazing, dazzling light. The face of Professor Jaggles appeared. The voice of the General thundered down towards us.
"Run, men, run like the wind."
I needed no encouragement. I flew out of that tunnel like an arrow from a bow. Fresh air blasted into my face. I stumbled over a rock and crashed down onto the crisp, clean snow. I was alive. I was free.
"That," the voice of Tando spluttered, "that was the most ghastly, the most horrendous, the most blood-curdling experience of me entire life. An experience I shall never forget."
"What happened?" I asked.
"The bats fear smoke," MacFiber explained. "That's what drove them away. They can't stomach it. I don't blame them living in the stifling tunnels of Crendorm. We should have lit torches beforehand."
"No firewood," answered Jaggles. "But as soon as we heard those dreadful squawks, the General allowed me to use some halvurandi. Just as well, really."
"Why didn't they kill me?" I questioned. "I had one right on my shoulder."
"It wasn't after you," Tando reasoned. "It was me who made the noise. Must have taken you for a rock."
"What about the others?" MacFiber asked.
"The tunnel's full of smoke by now," the General replied. "The bats will be long gone." "Here comes Hectus," Jaggles announced. "Is everyone all right?" "I think so," Hectus responded. "Was it bats?"
"Aye," Tando nodded. "Dozens and dozens of them. The stuff of nightmares. I hope we're not going in any more tunnels, sir. I don't think I could bear it."
No, the General confirmed. "We've taken a handy shortcut. We're not too far from the bottom now. Just a little further, and we'll be down on the flats."
The sun shone brightly for the rest of our descent, and the snow gradually began to melt. We reached the foot of Mount Trident by tea-time and settled down for a well-earned feast. Ramkhan obtained permission to go out hunting, and took Volko and Gevins as his companions. The rest of us gorged on meat pie and sausage sandwiches. I decided it was time to grill McFiber. "Would you mind a private word, Mr. McFiber?" I said to him. We wandered off to a large flat rock a little way from the camp. "Let me be completely honest with you," I began. "The General has asked me to undertake a thorough investigation into the murder of Mr. Rhombus." "Has he now?" McFiber replied, raising one eyebrow. "And I suppose I'm a suspect, am I?" "Everyone's a suspect, Mr. McFiber," I assured him. "But I thought you might be able to help me. You have an astute mind, Mr. McFiber, razor-sharp logic, and tremendous perspicacity."
"Flattery now, is it?" he remarked.
"Mr. Algothian thinks you may be aware of something the rest of us have missed. He said you've been hinting at something bizarre going on behind the scenes. Is there anyone you suspect?"
"Could be any of us, couldn't it? Could be you, Slank, my boy. I've read many mysteries in my time. It's usually the butler. There again, it could be Quilk. He could have made the whole thing up. He's a slimy, slippery fellow, if ever there was one. Or it could be me. Personally, I don't trust anyone."
"But have you made any logical deductions? Do you have any founded suspicions?"
"Ah, away with your questions. What gives you the right to head up the case? The General's overstepping his authority. This is a matter for the law officers."
"Wouldn't you rather the wolf be caught as soon as possible?"
"Of course I would, boy. But it's beyond our power. There's no way of finding him out. No way of getting proof or evidence. Believe me, Slank, I've been chewing over the matter constantly in my head. But it's no use. As long as there's always 3 of us on guard duty, we should be fine. The wolf's on his own. There's 10 of us and 1 of him. Now let the matter drop, Slank. I'm worn out. Go and interrogate someone else, why don't you?"
I did not seem to be making much progress in my inquiries. I obtained as little from McFiber as from Algothian. Was McFiber just being his usual prickly self, or was he attempting to cover his own guilt? It was impossible to discern. I decided to keep him on my list of suspects, along with Mr. Volko. In the morning, I thought I would seek the General's guidance as to how best to continue. I awoke early and immediately sought the counsel of the General. I found him busily writing in a silver notebook.
"Morning, Slank," he greeted cheerily. "I've decided to act upon one of your ideas. I'm penning an account of our passage through Kendom. Lessons in Leadership, I've called it."
"A most worthy undertaking, sir," I told him. "I wish to speak to you regarding my inquiries."
"Ah, yes," he exclaimed. "How are they going, Slank? Caught the killer yet?"
"Progress has not been as swift as I would have desired, sir."
"Well, who have you been with so far?"
"Hectus, Volko, Algothian, and McFiber. I've eliminated Hectus and Algothian."
"Good, good. It's obvious it isn't Hectus, isn't it? I mean, we know him. The same applies to McFiber. But what about Algothian? On what grounds have you dropped him?"
"His character, sir. He is all honour and decency. It is unthinkable that he could be the man." The General shook his head disapprovingly.
"Disappointing, Slank. Highly disappointing," he cried. "Don't ever become a detective, Slank. You can't dismiss someone just because they're nice. You can't judge by appearances, Slank. I'm surprised at you. Very superficial."
"On that basis, isn't dismissing Hectus and McFiber superficial as well, sir?"
"Not at all, Slank. Entirely different matter. We know them. We were acquainted with them in Rowendale. We shared a hut with them in Golga. We've had plenty of time to read them. Not so with Algothian. He could be anyone for all we know. He only arrived the day before the escape. It's too premature to dismiss him. You're being too superficial, Slank. Perhaps you need to change strategy a little. Press people harder. Be more direct. Probe them deeply. Get answers.
I fear that might rather vex people, sir.
Then let them be vexed, Slank. Maybe they'll show their true colours. Who's next on your list?
Mr. Tando, sir.
Mr. Tando? He hardly seems likely. He wouldn't have the pluck, let alone the strength. You might as well leave him till last.
Isn't that being superficial, sir?
Don't be impertinent, Slank. Go for Gevins. We all know he's prone to outbursts of violence. Remember his vicious attack on Volko? Press him hard, Slank. Press him hard.
Mr. Gevins was the last to awaken that morning. This afforded me the perfect opportunity to draw alongside him while everyone else was occupied with breakfast. I chose to heed the General's advice and adopt a different approach. "A successful hunt, Mr. Gevins?" I inquired, as he stirred from his rest.
"Morning, Mr. Slank," he yawned. "What did you say, sorry?"
"Did you have a successful hunt last night, with Mr. Ramkhan and Mr. Volko?"
"We certainly did, Mr. Slank. 2 birds, 1 boar, and 3 hedgehogs. That should keep us going for a couple of days."
"I'm surprised you went, Mr. Gevins. Wasn't it a little risky? Mr. Volko could have got you."
"What do you mean? I don't think I'll follow you, Mr. Slank."
"Well, it's obvious that Mr. Volko is the murderer, is it not? It's as plain as could be. He's a savage, brutish barbarian. You can never trust a Mardurian, Mr. Gevins."
"That's not fair, Mr. Slank. Me and Volko have had our differences, but you can't go accusing him like that. Have you got any evidence?"
I noted Gevins's reaction with great interest. If he were the murderer, he might well have jumped at the opportunity to deflect blame onto Volko. After all, several of the men seemed to suspect him. "I'm sorry, Mr. Gevins," I apologized. "I did not intend to upset you. I merely thought it unwise for you and Mr. Ramkhan to be alone with him like that."
"Mr. Volko's not that bad when you get to know him. You shouldn't jump to conclusions, Mr. Slank."
"Well, whom do you suspect, Mr. Gevins?"
"I've no idea. I'm no good at working things out like that. I ain't got no brains. But I don't think you should go spreading rumours about people. It's not fair."
I thought it best to retreat at that point and strike again later. I kept my distance from Gevins for most of the morning, choosing instead to walk with Quilk and Tando. The road was a great deal more pleasant today, and the weather has been vastly improving. We circled round the foot of Mount Trident and passed through a shaded valley with a little babbling stream. At lunchtime I made a second approach to Mr. Gevins. "I'm sorry about earlier, Mr. Gevins," I said to him. "You are quite right. It is most unjust of me to make unfounded accusations. I'm just rather anxious, that's all. It's shredding my nerves knowing that there's a killer about."
"Me too,"
Gevins admitted.
"I just think it's dangerous spreading rumours. Someone innocent could end up getting hurt."
"So how do you think we could find the real culprit?"
"I don't know, Mr. Slank. I told you, I ain't much good at thinking up plans."
"What did you think of Mr. Rhombus?" I put to him, attempting to be more direct.
"A lovely man," Gevins answered. "He was very nice to me. He didn't look down his nose at me like some of the others. I can't understand why anyone would want to kill him."
"Have you ever killed anyone, Mr. Gevins?"
"I beg your pardon, Mr. Slank. Are you accusing me now? That's not fair. Just 'cause I lose my temper sometimes doesn't mean I'm a killer. Why does everyone always pick on me? None of you like me. So I'm the murderer now, am I? Why don't you leave me alone?"
As predicted, my new approach was making me rather unpopular. Such is the cost of loyal obedience to one's master. By the 9th hour we were back on high ground again, and the clement weather began to elapse. Grey clouds gathered overhead, and a moderate wind arose. Time passed slowly, and my feet started to ache dreadfully. I have undertaken more walking in the last 2 weeks than in the past 7 years. It is beginning to take its toll. I have acquired several irritating blisters, and my shoes have been punctured in at least 2 places. And we still have such a long way to go. Even when we have crossed out of the Empire, we have the jungles of Mesonestia and the hills of Galvia to negotiate. Home seems such a great distance away. Part of me feels that it would have been far easier to return directly to the battle zone and save ourselves a grueling journey. The other part of me rejoices at the prospect of marching back into Galliminia, and seeing her for whom my heart yearns with unrelenting passion. Perhaps she will view me as a gallant hero, and fall irretrievably in love with me. Or perhaps she will dismiss me as a contemptible coward, running away from battle. Either way, my soul aches to behold her once again. We made our evening camp in a small sheltered grove, and I had thought to approach Mr. Gevins one last time. But then I observed him writing in a little red book. I had seen him writing in it several times before, and I presumed it was his diary. This, I thought, could be a most valuable source of information. Not only could I gain a better understanding of the man, but I would be able to investigate what he had written about Merlin Rhombus. There could be vital clues hidden within its pages. I did not think it would be particularly challenging to obtain the diary, especially under cover of dark. I laid my blankets next to his and waited for nightfall. What a fascinating read it proved to be! His style may be somewhat inelegant, but I have actually found myself quite moved. I learned so much about the man, the loss of his beloved Mirinda, his constant struggles with low self-esteem, his persecution complex. I must confess to feeling rather rebuked. My conduct towards him had not always been as courteous and gracious as perhaps it should have been. I felt more than a little ashamed. Most importantly, however, I deemed that the diary cleared him entirely of the abominable crime of murder. The manner in which he wrote about Rhombus and his death indicated a sincere respect for the man and a deep sorrow over his demise. I did not believe that Gevins had the intelligence or the craft to feign such feelings. I could strike off another name from my list. I had been looking forward to my next subject for quite some time. Professor Jaggles, I felt sure, would make a compelling study. The finger of accusation had already been pointed to him, and not without good reason. Nobody knows much about him. He is highly secretive, and he always kept very much to himself back in Gruken-Golga. Of course, the same could be said of Mr. Ramkhan, but at least he has verifiable identification upon him. Most significant of all is the fact that the professor is a Halvirandus. He had managed to keep this concealed from us for quite some time, so it was easy to imagine him hiding further secrets. Where had he learned this ancient art? Why had he kept it a secret? Was he even a genuine Galamine? These were questions to which I was determined to find answers. I used his age and comparative frailty as an excuse for approaching him. "Do you need a hand, Professor?" I inquired as he gathered up his bags and blankets.
"Not at all," he replied indignantly. "I may be advanced in years, but there's plenty of strength left in the old body."
"I've just made the General a cup of tea," I told him. "Would you care for one too?" The Professor gave me a long, hard look.
"I know what you're up to, my dear fellow," he said. "I'm not a fool, you know. I've been watching you, Mr. Slank. Yesterday it was Gevins. The day before it was McFiber. Attaching yourself to someone different every day. My turn now, is it? Old Monty got you up to it, has he?"
I was rather taken aback by the Professor's acuity. I thought it best to be completely candid. "You are most observant, Professor," I said to him. "I shan't deny it. The General has asked me to investigate all the men."
"Well, I expect you'll have a field day with me," joked the Professor. "Strange old gentleman, practised in Halvirandi, claiming to be in the intelligence division. Interesting case, am I not? Well, my dear fellow, I won't be obstructive. I'll give you 3 questions. Fire away. First question."
I found the professor's manner very unnerving, but I decided to take advantage of his openness. "Very well, Professor," I replied. "There were one or two matters I wanted to clear up. First of all, where did you live before you moved to Baltham? We can check the registers, you see."
"No fixed address, I'm afraid."
"You moved from house to house?"
"Not really. Never lived in a house, you see. Not since childhood. It's just me and my sea chest."
"You live out of a sea chest?"
"More inside the sea chest. Well, not really inside it in actual fact, but let's not go into technicalities now. Let's just say my sea chest is a more than adequate abode. Next question."
"Where did you learn Halvirandi?"
"Easy question. From my father. It's been in our family for generations. Originally, of course, my ancestors were taught it by Rhaegwyn himself."
"Who's Rhaegwyn?"
"You haven't heard of Rhaegwyn, my dear fellow? You astonish me. I thought you were an educated man, Mr. Slank. Rhaegwyn was one of the 7 protectors, 7 men commissioned to guard ancient Ganvor from all evil. You surely must have heard of them. You do surprise me. One more question, Mr. Slank. I won't count your sub-questions. I'm a fair-minded fellow."
"Who do you think killed Rhombus?"
"Interesting, Mr. Slank. Fascinating. Trying to gauge my reaction, are you? Will I point the accusing finger at someone else? Whom will I pick? I wonder what you'll conclude. Let me see. If I were to take a guess, and a pure guess it would be, my dear fellow, I'd place my money on Mr. Ramkhan. We've seen him in action, haven't we? A talented killer. Man of mystery, too. Most unsociable. Still, I could be completely and utterly wrong. Maybe I'm playing along with your game just to cover myself. Maybe I'm the killer. I wish you luck, my dear fellow, but now perhaps you'll leave me in peace and pick your next target. Lovely chatting to you, Mr. Slank. Farewell, my dear fellow."
I obliged the Professor by withdrawing immediately, and contented myself with observing him from a distance. I was unable to discern whether his behaviour was due to quirky eccentricity, or was a clever ploy to confuse and disorientate me. I puzzled over the matter for most of the day. By early afternoon we had reached Orkstrombus, the final mountain before Stevros. Tall, steep, and cloaked in fog, it formed the most daunting and disheartening sight. Thankfully, we did not have to climb all the way to its lofty summit, but merely pass over its lowermost slopes. The general assured us that it would be a straightforward and undemanding venture. However, upon scrambling over the first of its ridges, we made a startling discovery. Standing threateningly before us, strong, powerful, and seemingly invincible, was an enormous red dragon. Everything about it filled me with alarm and panic. Fierce black eyes glared down upon us. Smoke streamed from its flaring nostrils. Long, glistening teeth were ostentatiously displayed. A thick, spiny crest ran down its sinuous neck to the tip of its tail, which was shaped like an arrow. 4 muscular limbs with black-clawed feet supported its immense scaly body. 2 bat-like wings were outstretched at its sides. My heart froze with terror. "Look!" Ramkhan exclaimed. "Be not fearing, gentlemen. The beast is shackled." He pointed to one of the dragon's hind legs, which was secured to a rock by a long silver chain. The dragon fixed us with an intent, angry stare. "Not Gregomines," it said, the glare flickering away from its eyes. "Grochukans? No, not Grochukans. Tromines? No, too big for Tromines." The great monster eyed us up and down and snorted with frustration. "Galamines!" it then cried in triumph. "You are Galamines!"
"Yes, Galamines indeed," the general confirmed. "Armed Galamines, but we come in peace."
"Wonderful," the dragon smiled. "How refreshing to see nice, peaceful Galamines after years of those belligerent Gregomines. That's all I ever see these days. Gregomines, Gregomines, Gregomines."
"Who is it that has tied you up?"
Professor Jaggles inquired. "Who do you think?" the dragon wailed. "Those nasty little Gregomines caught me by surprise one day. Now I'm their prize weapon. Gregomines are always fighting each other, you see. Now they've started capturing dragons to use in battle. It's a miserable life, I can tell you. Misery, misery, misery."
"Let's set 'em free, sir,"
Hectus proposed. "Best not," Macfiber advised. "Could prove very dangerous."
"No danger, gracious Gallymines," the dragon insisted. "No danger at all. I'd be your debtor forever. Show pity, gentle Gallymines."
"Macfiber's right," the general pronounced. "We can't risk being eaten for supper. We're no match for a beast like that." "Nonsense!" the professor exclaimed. "Dragons are our friends, General. Don't be such a heartless brute."
"How dare you speak to me like that?"
the general growled.
"Have you taken leave of your senses?"
"I can't stand by and watch a noble creature suffer," the professor asserted, marching down towards the dragon.
"Come back here this instant,"
the general ordered.
"What are you doing, Professor? Get back here at once."
Jaggles defiantly ignored the general and crouched down by the dragon's foot. "It's a simple locking system," he called back. "I have an excellent tool for this sort of thing."
"I'll have you before the tribunal for this,"
the general threatened.
"If there's one thing I can't abide, it's rank disobedience."
"There you are, my dear fellow," the professor beamed. "Your enslavement is over."
"Thank you, noble Gallymine," the dragon roared. "Thank you with all my heart. I am your debtor forever. Freedom, freedom, freedom."
"There we are, General," the professor grinned. "No harm done."
"I'll have words with you later," the general shouted. "Now let's get away from here before it turns on us. Come along, men, off we go."
The professor's stubborn disobedience surprised me greatly. It is not the first time he has clashed with the general, but to defy direct order so brazenly is outrageous in the extreme. Either he was entirely out of his mind, or he was not at all frightened by the prospect of a military tribunal. Perhaps he was an enemy spy, but why would he risk exposing the fact by so open a display of rebellion? I struggled to find an answer. I determined to seek at least one more opportunity to cross-examine the professor. I chose my moment carefully. We had made a reasonable fire in a secluded trough, and were enjoying generous chunks of delicious roast boar. The professor was humming to himself in the corner, and looked to be in good humour. "Good evening, Professor," I greeted.
"Back again, are we?"
he teased.
"Round two, is it? You're lucky I'm in a clement mood."
"What did the general say to you?" I asked.
"His bark is worse than his bite,"
the professor smiled.
"He gave me a final warning. Next time I'll be put in front of the tribunal."
"You've escaped lightly," I said. "You really can't carry on defying him like that."
"I couldn't help myself, Mr. Slank. I've always had a soft spot for dragons. Owe my life to one, in fact. I suppose I ought to show a little more deference, though. He is a general after all. I shall try to mend my ways. Anyway, I'm expecting some more searching questions, Mr. Slank."
"I just have one, Professor. You work for the Intelligence Division, do you not? What were you doing inside the Empire?"
"Good question, my dear fellow. Checking out my backstory, are you? It's a simple enough answer. The Grochuchans are developing a new weapon, some sort of handheld shooting device that fires metal shells. The ID sent me to try and get a look at it."
"Undercover?"
"Never got that far, as it happens. I was caught within 2 days of landing in the Empire. I was in Golga ever since."
"Why didn't they send a younger man?"
"All the younger men signed up for the army, didn't they? Besides, it's intelligence they value in the ID, not youth and vigour. But I think you've had your fill of questions, Mr. Slank. I've tried to be as helpful as I can. Who is it tomorrow, then? Mr. Tando? Mr. Ramkhan?"
"Thank you for your help, Professor," I replied, choosing to ignore his question. "I shall leave you in peace now."
Professor Jaggles continued to be an inscrutable mystery. I found it impossible to evaluate him satisfactorily. He would remain firmly on my list of suspects, but I felt I was no closer to comprehending him than I was before. Today, the sequence of events unfolded which led to my imprisonment here in this hideous darkness. The story is frightful, shocking, and deplorable in the extreme. My chosen subject today was Mr. Ramkhan Zebaniah. I did not anticipate deriving much information from him, for he is a man of few words. In fact, before today, I cannot recall exchanging so much as a sentence with him all week. Solemn, private, and painfully unsociable, Mr. Ramkhan is even more of a mystery than Professor Jaggles. In order to gain access to him, I volunteered for a hunting expedition. It meant rising very early from bed, but at least I would win time with the elusive Baromian. Quilk and Algothian were to be our companions. An hour before dawn, we packed our bags and marched off into a nearby valley. "Remember, gentlemen," Ramkhan instructed, "silence, patience, and vigilance. Those are the keys to a successful hunt." "What are we after?" Quilk queried. "Whatever we can be finding," came the reply. "There will not be good hunting ground for quite a while after this." "And what are we supposed to use?" Quilk asked. "I have a handful of tulkin spikes in my bag," Ramkhan answered. "But I am wanting you for eyes, mostly. Leave the killing to me. My knife will be far more accurate." "There's something moving straight ahead," Algothian exclaimed.
"Down, gentlemen," Ramkhan whispered. "It is a lone deer. Quilk, you be calling round to the left. Minimum noise, remember. Algothian, you be cutting it off to the right. If it is running in your direction, fire a spike."
"What shall I do, Mr. Ramkhan?" I inquired.
"Be staying here with a spike," he replied. "If I miss, you can be taking a shot."
We lay silently upon the smooth brown grass, waiting for the deer to come more clearly into view. "May I ask you a question, Mr. Ramkhan?" I whispered.
"As long as you are keeping quiet," Ramkhan replied, "and keeping your eyes on the prey."
"How is it that you were in Golga before the rest of us?"
"I was in the Empire long before the invasion. I was sent in as an assassin. My mission, to be killing General Vralin. Our government was wanting him dead for crimes against the Baromian people. But I was caught and thrown into Golga. 4 months of torture and torment. Then the war is starting. Golga was converted into a prisoner of war fortress, and all you lot came pouring in. 2 months more of misery, and then at last I am free."
"Anyone else on your hit list?"
"Not Mr. Rhombus, if that is being your meaning. General Vralin is the only man I was being asked to take down. Not that I would mind adding Mr. Barakos to the list. He is the one who is going to be turning Golga back into a torture house. If we are getting captured again, well, it is not something we want to be thinking about."
I was about to ask a further question when I found my mouth being smothered by Ramkhan's hand. The deer was in plain sight, and Ramkhan reached for his knife. He was about to fire when a loud cry pierced the air. It sounded like Algothian. We hurried over towards him and discovered him under attack from a party of vicious Gregomines. He had managed to retreat up a leafy conifer, but an angry mob had encircled the tree. Ramkhan drew his knife, but found himself pounced upon by 2 of the Gregomines. We were outnumbered. I sped off into the trees, but a horde of the little brutes came after me. All of a sudden, a volley of arrows came sailing through the air. Loud screams echoed through the valley. I dived for cover. Moments later, a strong hand grabbed hold of my arm and pulled me up to my feet. There before me was a red-cloaked archer with scruffy black hair and copious stubble.
"Greetings, stranger,"
he said to me, extending his hand. "Greetings," I returned. "And who might you be?"
"The name's Ralkov," the archer announced. "Her Majesty's Air Force 16th Squadron. Looks like I arrived just in time."
You are saving our lives, Ramkhan acknowledged, coming over towards us.
All in a day's work, old boy, Ralkov smiled. They're easy enough targets, the Gregomines. Poisoned arrows for venomous little monsters.
What are you doing here? I asked.
Part of a reconnaissance team, Ralkov explained. We're planning an attack on Stavros. I might ask you the same question. I can see you're not Grochukans.
Escaped prisoners, I informed him, from Grukan-Golga.
Grukan-Golga, Ralkov said. You've come a long way. I applaud your achievements. Just the 3 of you, is it?
There's another not far off, Ramkhan answered, and 11 of us all told.
11 escaped prisoners, Ralkov exclaimed. Well, that's quite a feat. I'd love to meet the rest of you. Perhaps I can be of assistance.
Once we had collected Quilk, we escorted Ralkov back to our camp and presented him to the general. Allow me to introduce Mr. Ralkov of Her Majesty's Air Force, I announced. He saved us from an attack of Gregomines.
The Air Force, eh? The general said. Delighted to meet you.
This is our leader, Quilk told Ralkov. General Montagolin.
General Lord Montagolin, actually,
the general corrected.
Well, well, Ralkov cried. General Lord Montagolin, what an honour. Commander Questus speaks very highly of you. You have your identity papers, I trust? The general asked. But of course, Ralkov replied, removing them from his pocket. We're here scouting the area before a full-scale assault. 3 whole squadrons will launch an attack in 10 days' time. Stavros won't stand a chance. That's rather gratifying to hear, the general said. I've been rather out of touch since being in Grukan-Golga. You'll have to give me a full report. Yes, of course, Ralkov promised. We have an inn just on the edge of Stavros run by one of our spies. We use it as a refuge for stray pilots and sailors. You can stay the night there. It's only about 10 miles away. We'll be there in time for lunch. Excellent, the general beamed. That sounds wonderful. What's your plan, if you don't mind my asking? Where are you headed? Back to Galamenia. With Her Majesty's permission, I intend to amass a force big enough for a direct assault on Grukan-Golga. How are you crossing the bay? I can fix a boat for you if you'd like. I have an old sailor friend in Stavros. He'll get you across no problem. Excellent. We were intending to go round the bay, but crossing it will be far quicker. I'm glad we bumped into you, Mr. Ralkov. Very glad indeed. The pleasure's all mine, General. It's a real honour to meet you, sir.
Over breakfast, the general described our adventures in vivid detail, giving particular attention to his own wisdom and courage in leadership. In return, Ralkov gave us a full report of how the war was progressing. Apparently, the Royal Armada had inflicted devastating blows on the Grochukan fleet at Karkanva, and our armies in the Empire had advanced more than 20 miles. We were greatly encouraged by the news. But then came a moment of horror that I shall never forget as long as I live.
I could give you a fuller picture with the aid of a map, Ralkov told us. Does anyone have one with them? You've got a map, haven't you, Slank? The general said.
Indeed I have, sir, I confirmed. My bag's just over there by your feet, Mr. Ralkov. Ralkov began to rummage around inside my bag, and a puzzled expression appeared on his face. He drew out a long metal object.
What's this? He inquired. Looks like a wagon brake. It is, Quilk shouted. It's our wagon brake, the very same. You know what this means, don't you, sir? Slanky Boy's the killer.
Don't be ridiculous, I protested. It's been planted there. Somebody's trying to frame me.
Nonsense, exclaimed Quilk. If it's a plant, you'd have noticed it before, wouldn't you? You can't pretend that dirty great thing's been jangling around in your bag and you never realised.
The general looked at me with utter incredulity. His face went deathly pale.
I can't believe it, he stammered. It's impossible. After all these years, Slank, I'm appalled.
You can't deny what you see with your own eyes, sir, MacFiber said. I should have guessed, I suppose. It's always the butler.
This is most unjust, I complained. That break doesn't prove I'm the killer.
I'm very sorry, Slank,
the General said softly.
It pains me to do this, but I really have no choice. Quilk, MacFiber, tie him up, men. It seems the wolf has been found.
I was stunned and heartbroken that the General could lose faith in me so easily. I was utterly distraught. Without even giving me the chance to defend myself, he had me bound and shackled and led across the plains like a convict. Upon reaching the inn at Stavros, I was hurled into the cellar and have remained here for at least 5 hours. My opinion of the General has sunk to depths I never dreamed it could possibly reach. At present, I consider him the most unworthy and unreasonable man in all Galliminia. Is this how he repays years of loyalty? Is this how much he thinks of me? As I have been sitting here in the cheerless gloom, cold and numb and full of woe, an unthinkable thought has been plaguing my mind. It is a thought almost too shocking to express. I begin to suspect the General himself.